Bon dia, moltes gràcies. Primer de tot, evidentment, vull agrair de manera emfàtica el convit a presentar aquesta sessió a la Llengües i a l'Alícia en particular. És un privilegi perquè crec que presento dues persones que no poden estar més en línia o ser més coherents amb els objectius i la manera de veure les coses, de veure les llengües que té tant Llengües com el Gela i que és d'alguna manera, per sintetitzar-ho, una mena d'imbricació indestriable entre el que és recerca, per tant, coneixement i activisme, dues coses que crec que representen molt bé aquestes dues persones que tenim amb nosaltres. Començarà per parlar el doctor Llanes, m'ha donat permís per dir-li Gené perquè sembla ser que el seu nom té origen català i suposo que no és com li diuen habitualment, no Gené, però és allò d'anada i tornada. Gené Llanes és antropòleg, format a Mèxic, doctorat de Sussex, al Regne Unit, treballa actualment a la Universitat de Leiden. El seu camp de recerca preferencial són les formes d'art lligades a la revitalització lingüística i cultural, especialment l'activisme digital. En aquesta àrea ha treballat molt amb la seva pròpia cultura, maia yucateca, però també amb diverses cultures americanes. El web que té la Universitat de Leiden, d'ell mateix, diu que per comprendre les nocions d'herència cal un coneixement complex de les perspectives locals i una pràctica basada en el diàleg intercultural i en metodologies descolonitzadores. Col·labora amb una sèrie d'organitzacions, moltes organitzacions que treballen per la revitalització i la reivindicació de l'herència lingüística i cultural americana i té una bibliografia extensa, molt interessant i molt vinculada també, com deia, tant a fer créixer el coneixement com a l'activisme cultural que podeu consultar a la bibliografia que té a la web de la Universitat de Leiden. No fa gaire va estar a Barcelona amb un seminari interessantíssim sobre la cultura maia i com la llengua maia es revitalitza i d'alguna manera es desfà d'estigmes que solen tenir llengües minoritzades, etc., com és vincular-les amb el passat, aquestes coses a través del rap i una sèrie de grups molt interessants. Per tant, quan vulguis. Moltes gràcies.
Gràcies, Pere. Bon dia, quin titular, So I hope that my presentation will make sense in the context of this wonderful time that we have had together. The 7 people with whom we formed this very interesting, lively, quite happy community during these 7, almost 10 days. So I was actually many of the topics that Pere has already listened from me before are part of what I came back to review and to think about and to try to find some ways of increasing my understanding of what is happening today in the Yucatan Peninsula, my home region in Mexico, in relation to revitalization and the destigmatizing of my language. Out of the many conversations that we had during the residency, it became clear that the process is more complex. The process has many angles that we need to explore. I need to explore, also in conversation with the people who are at the forum of this particular movement of renewed cultural expression in the Yucatan. So just to give you a little bit of taste about my home region, this is the Yucatan Peninsula in the southeastern corner of Mexico. The Yucatan faces to the Gulf of Mexico on the one side and to the Caribbean Sea on the other side. For many years we were closer to Cuba, Puerto Rico and Colombia than we were to Mexico City, which also explains the vitality of the Mayan language. The territory is almost 150,000 square kilometers, which is roughly the size of Bangladesh or Greece or Nicaragua or Bulgaria or Guatemala or Hungary. to name a few countries with the approximate size that the Yucatan Peninsula has. And this region is particularly interesting for many people in Mexico because we share an indigenous language. So the language is spoken almost in the entire territory. I'll show you a map shortly. And we have been for many years interconnected by different family relationships, trade networks, political relationships, and so on. So in the Yucatec Maya world, there are approximately 800,000, between 800,000 and 1 million speakers of the Yucatec Maya language, which is one language out of a family of 32, 33 approximately. And this language is the second most spoken language among the Maya languages in the world, including Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. And it's also the second most spoken language in Mexico, in the entire country, after Nahuatl, which was the language of the so-called Aztec Empire. This is the distribution today of speakers of the language. As you can see, most of the people concentrate in the north. And in the last century, there has been a remarkable, very worrying erosion of the presence of the language in different parts of the Yucatan Peninsula. At the beginning of the century, according to some historians, 90% of the people were speakers of the language, including immigrants from Korea, immigrants from Lebanon, immigrants from Catalonia, who came to the Yucatan Peninsula at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, and who learned the language. So they were probably at home were speakers of Catalan on the streets of Mérida, the capital. They were speakers of Spanish, but when they traveled to the interior of the province, they were probably speakers of Maya. So this is something that perhaps needs also some research, and hopefully from some of the universities here in Barcelona, some will come up with this idea, and if they want to collaborate, it will be interesting to do. But along the 20th century, the language became eroded, and this was to a very large extent due to the nationalist policies of the Mexican state. So Mexico became independent from Spain in 1821, and during the whole of the 19th century there was a lot of internal battles between liberals and conservatives. Eventually the liberals won this cultural war, but they became rather conservative at the end of the 19th century. And after the revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, finally the Mexican state consolidated, so they could have a stronger hold on the country as a whole, and they introduced national education and the imposition of Spanish as the only language of the country in different parts of the republic. And so this is the moment when Maya starts to lose its presence, its visibility, and its use, basically the capacity that they had to communicate people with each other. And today, most of the population, most of the Mayan speakers concentrate in cities. Which is the Maya name of the capital of the Yucatan, Mérida, and Cancun. Cancun is a Maya name, a Maya word. Concentrate 9% and 7% respectively of these nearly 1 million speakers of the Maya language. And in the last decade and a half, a lot of Maya speakers started migrating to the United States, and they concentrate for the most part in the San Francisco Bay Area, but there must be something like 14,000 or 20,000 speakers of Maya, and they are the largest Mexican immigrant population in this part of the United States. So the diaspora of Maya speakers has been growing for a very long time, and with the diaspora also new challenges. And the main challenge is that Mexican national education basically created a stigma in relation to, which was always there, but the Mexican national state created a stigma that presented my language as a language of the past. So at the end of the 20th century, a number of activists, a number of language activists in the Yucatan started trying to improve the quality of the spaces that the Maya language occupied in the public sphere, and I came up with the idea of promoting new genres, new musical genres in which Maya people could sing in their own language. And at the beginning, these musical genres were relatively conventional in the sense that they were popular in Mexico as a whole, but they were considered music of working class people, or popular music like cumbias, rancheras, romantic songs or ballads, and to some extent orchestra. And this was a project of the Mexican state, who has the Mexican state has a very ambivalent relationship with the indigenous cultures historically. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's an interesting, almost perverse relationship, the one that the Mexican state has with its indigenous populations. But however, at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, young people from central Quintana Roo, in the eastern region where a lot of Maya speakers concentrate, they started using hip-hop, using reggae, and many other genres to sing in their own language. And this came completely out of the blue. This was not promoted by the state. The previous attempt to renew the musical repertoire of Maya people came from the state, from some state institutions. But this was a more organic process of re-emergence of Maya creativity. And this young person here, Jesus Pat, known in the hip-hop circles as Pat Boy, the kid Pat. So he was the first one who coined the term bobochi, which means to hit something with the mouth, in a way translating the notion of hip-hop to his own experience as a young Maya person. He created a label in 2015 called ADN Maya, or Maya DNA, and they started producing songs that eventually reached different audiences. I want to play you a couple of songs, a couple of extracts. This is a song called I'm Happy, which El País, the cultural supplement of El País online, reported in 2016, I think, if I'm not wrong. So I'm just going to play you this and another song just to give you a taste of the kind of music that these young people do. This one doesn't have a subtitle. So basically, what these young people sing about is their life in the rural towns and rural villages. There's an element of ethnic pride, clearly. This last song that I didn't have time to create subtitles for They're basically saying, we are Maya people, we are Maya young people, and here we are, and we like to sing in Maya, and we invite you to talk in the Maya language, and so on. So in many ways, this statement of cultural pride is part of the common theme in many of these songs. So young people constantly trying to express the local pride, the regional pride. And ironically or paradoxically, by using hip hop, which is often associated with the United States and with cultural consumption at a global scale, this global hypermodern sort of genre is strongly associated back again with poverty, with ruralness, with some sort of sense of tradition, which is not wrong by itself, but in the context of continuous stigmatization of the Maya language, it might prove counterproductive, right? So there's a question there. Well, it's a question that I ask myself and present to some of my fellow residents. We had a little bit of a presentation and we created this conversation, and they in turn, and I also presented other forms of singing Maya songs, which I'm going to play you just briefly as well. This is a different style, and in a way it's a more political sort of statement. There's a lot of anger and political vindications here. This is a style of rap that has emerged from a different circles, different circuits. And what I want to say is that Maya hip hop or the new Maya song is very diverse. It's by no means totally controlled by the state or totally autonomous. There's a lot of spaces in between. But what is interesting is that, and not surprisingly, that the state and a lot of the commercial circuits are very resistant to program or to even give stage to this kind of cultural expression, which is quite understandable from the point of view of the state and also from the point of view of the establishment. Here, as you can see, Mayaness is expressed not so much in terms of tradition or ruralness, but it's more political positioning in relation to tourism, global investment, territorial displacement, and so on. In between, and in our conversations with Residència, my colleagues made me realize is that there's also a lot of potential in intermediate or we might say moderate expressions. So I'm just going to play you this one, which is a beautiful video.
Bello, Shikal Barbol, Little Jasmine, Novelo, Kimakola, Bobochi, Mayatan, Golish Kai, Nana, Bello. kaki majawili waktu kalkam ushawi rakale banyano itani makulan kami shima lakal kai masawaka waktu itani chukatan sukutana le mayata terjebak wanik unye masha konis kali kilemaya kita sikendeli musical konis kali balales konis kali balales tulakales kupides tunakin shot
Okay, so as you can see, there's I mean, here the insistence is not so much on the tradition or on the ruralness or on local pride, but it's also an open invitation to other people. It's an attempt to reach across the, however artificial, ethnic divide between Mexicans, mainstream Mexicans, you might call them, or mestizos, as we do call them in Mexico, and the Mayan people. So here are different styles, different ways of approaching the challenge of destigmatizing, renewing the musical repertoire, renewing the feel of cultural expression in the Maya region, and hip hop became such a big trend in probably the first 5 years of this re-emergence of musical creation. Quite the role among fundamentally hipsters in Mexico City and some cultural functionaries and bureaucrats, which is okay. I mean, those are the ones in charge of making decisions. But some other people became a little bit dissatisfied with this sudden focus on hip hop, which displays other genres, and they, among them, Yasmin Novello, who is part of the previous video that we saw. Yasmin is one of the most tenacious cultural promoters, language activists in the Yucatan. She and a group of young people created a digital radio station which broadcasts in the Maya language only, and you can listen to Radio Yuyun on the internet. They only broadcast 1 day a week because that's all they can do. The radio works on a voluntary basis, but the work is really stubborn way of making the Maya language present in the online sphere, in the cybersphere. She, in a conversation that I had with her recently, she manifested her, rather weirdness about the fact that hip hop was all the rage. Hip hop was attracting all of the attention, and she said that as a woman, she finds hip hop to be quite a challenging genre because she said if you are a woman, you want to express your rage, you want to express your critique of traditional culture in a different way. We like to sing slower songs, romantic songs. We like to talk about ourselves and not so much about tradition. So she presents an alternative, and she and a group that she formed are trying to create a new sort of approach to new Maya song. And her band or her group is called Humil Mons, which means the root of the sound of the roots. The sound of the roots. She has some songs online, but they still haven't managed to record any album, but they are in the process of doing that. So reception of new Mayan music has been quite new Maya song has been quite celebrated along with many other new musical expressions in the country. So these are festivals sponsored by the state, but also with some curators which work in the middle between, serving to community and serving to institutions. This is the main platform for many of these young musicians. Another example is this interesting festival in Mexico City, Multilingual Roar, Estruendo Multilingue, which is, was the creation of a Nahua activist, Nahua writer, who's based in Mexico City, Martonio Carvalho, and who in conversation with some cultural bureaucrats in Mexico City, came up with this idea, which has been later taken up by the state. Reception has also been quite important by the media. So I mentioned the video of the Tijo rappers, these young guys from Tijosuco, a community in the eastern area. In 2016, this piece by El País in Verne, the cultural supplement online, increased significantly the number of hits and views in the YouTube video, the YouTube channel of ADN Maya. You can just type, if you are curious, just go to YouTube and type ADN Maya and you'll find all of the previews and the new music videos that they have produced. They have a respectable number of hits and views, and interestingly, the reception that the more traditional kind of hip hop or the more rural image that Maya people project of themselves is the best received by the mestizo or the mainstream Mexicans, because it sort of confirms a lot of the biases, a lot of the stereotypes that they still hold about indigenous communities. So it's paradoxical. The least I can say is that this is paradoxical. The other expressions, hip hop in 2 languages, hip hop that is very political, that is received with suspicion by mainstream Mexicans, because they say this is not indigenous. They're talking about politics. How come they are presenting this challenge to the stage, right? So there's a lot of suspicion about that. There's a lot of suspicion about music that do not speak about the tradition, that do not speak about cultural items, cultural practice, and so this is a little bit of a paradox. This is the English standard, you already gathered it. Circulation is a key challenge for all these expressions. So far, very few new Maya songs have made it to Spotify, for instance. A lot of this is promoted online on YouTube, but Spotify, which is the main source of music consumption for the global audiences, that's proven to be a more difficult space, a more difficult platform to reach, right? So the challenge is still there. So what are my observations after this first week? So New Maya Song is a crucial moment is in a crucial moment right now. So it's still in construction. The space is still in construction. There's a lot of different aspects of creativity that need to be worked out. Sometimes, from afar, and as a Maya person myself, I see this with very little sophistication. And I go there and look at the aesthetics of the language, and I say, this is so simple. This is just like reggaeton. It has the lyrical complexity of reggaeton, but in Maya. So not very complex. But the field is in construction, and it seems important for me as a researcher, as a Maya person, to continue documenting the change and the diversity of Maya Kai, both old and new, and to try to understand these challenges, distribution, and also the creation of a space which is that could be semi-autonomous from the tutelage of the Mexican state, because the Mexican state creates very perverted dynamics. And what next? So during the time of the Faber Residency, and for which I thank Alicia, Monica, Meli, and all of the team of Linguapax, and of course a big thanks to Frances, who has been such a wonderful person to work with. All of these questions have emerged. We will talk about that later, and I hope that we can I can hear you. I can hear your opinions and your suggestions and your comments as well. So thank you very much.
Moltes gràcies, Janet, per aquesta interessant exposició. Ara doncs és el torn de la doctora Sheena Shah, que vam preparant ràpidament, tindrem més temps. La doctora Shah és investigadora de la mítica Escola d'Estudis Orientals i Africans de la Universitat de Londres, el SOAS, llicenciada i màster en Llengües Modernes i Medievals de Cambridge, doctora a Georgetown. També ha estat recercadora en el Centre de Diversitat Lingüística Africana de la Universitat de la Ciutat del Cap, on hi ha un vell conegut de Linguapax, el doctor Presenta. Ha dut a terme un munt de treball de camp a diverses comunitats lingüístiques africanes, entre les quals unes quantes de la coneguda família Khoisan pels famosos clics, un grup de llengües molt amenaçades, la majoria, però també amb altres llengües com per exemple el gujarati de la diàspora o fins i tot l'alemany a l'Àfrica Austral. El seu interès se centra en les llengües amenaçades, la documentació, la revitalització, les polítiques lingüístiques o les llengües de l'educació. També podeu consultar les seves publicacions en un web personal que té, molt complet, i a més on ofereix generosament accés a algunes de les publicacions que potser no són tan fàcils de trobar o no almenys de franc, diguem-ne. He vist que té últimament moltes col·laboracions justament amb el doctor Presenta. Doctora Shah.
Thank you very much. So one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently, and especially this past week, is the role of linguists and language activists in language revitalization projects. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a linguist who's been involved in the documentation and revitalization of understudied endangered languages in Southern Africa since 2008. And one of the things I wanted to bring to the floor was, what do we as linguists mean when we talk about documenting endangered languages? Now this subfield of linguistics, language documentation, it emerged about 25 years ago. And it emerged as a response to the growing crisis of language endangerment. And it involves collecting, describing, and archiving materials on such languages. Now, what are the steps we as linguists undertake when we document endangered languages? And I wanted to describe this process, these steps, through my own personal experience. So I've recently begun a project where I'm documenting an endangered language spoken in Lesotho, and the name of this language is called Sephuthi, and it's spoken in scattered villages in southern Lesotho with about, say, 20,000 or so speakers. And in order to document this language, I undertake field work, and this involves, first and foremost, preparing a lot back home. So I live in Hamburg, and in Hamburg I'm preparing all the necessary equipment. So on the slide here you can see just some of my equipment, a lot of video recorders, audio recorders, microphones, batteries, SD cards, external hard drives, etc. And because I work in villages where there's no electricity, I've also got to think a lot about logistics. So solar panels, where am I going to stay? So I have a tent, etc. And then the next step is I need to travel to my field site. So this involves several forms of transport. First of all, flight to Southern Africa, usually to a city in South Africa. Then a long car journey to Lesotho. The road conditions are not very good. You can see this is one of the main roads in Lesotho, and it doesn't look like a main road that we might be familiar with here. Some of the villages where I work, there are no roads, so it involves a lot of hiking, crossing rivers, riding donkeys. And then finally, after several days, I actually make it to the village where I need to work, and then I need to get set up. And because this is a village where, this is a community I've been working with now for the past 2 years, they know me there, I know how the whole setup is there, so I pitch my tent, take out my solar panel, and begin my work. What does this work involve? So it involves primarily collecting data, primary data of people speaking, telling stories, singing songs, discussing their life histories, their past, topics of interest. It might also involve specific methods or techniques. So depending on what I'm interested in, if I have a specific research question that I want to find answers for, I might use specific specific techniques. So you can see the top left-hand picture. This is me doing a technique called palatography. And this technique is used by linguists when they're interested in figuring out the sounds in the language. How are the sounds produced? And this is done when you're working on understudied languages, when you don't know much about the language. And it involves you mixing charcoal and olive oil together, and you create a bit of a paste. And then you work with your speaker and you ask them, can I paint your tongue or the roof of your mouth? And once you paint that, you ask them to say a sound, like, and as soon as they say the sound, you take a photo of their tongue and the roof of the mouth, and that allows you to see what was in contact with each other in the mouth. And so this is just one of many methods I used in linguistic elicitation. And in all of this work that you do, you're directly involving and engaging with community members and hopefully also training them to be part of this project, to help you with the documentation so that they can continue doing this work if they're interested in doing this. I use many different technology, as I mentioned, so you're using audio recorders, video recorders, and this obviously produces data in various formats. And it's always important when we're working with communities to check that first of all, they know what we're doing, that they're okay with what we're doing, and that with each recording that we get their consent to be recorded, so obtaining informed consent. And once we have the recordings, I work with the community members to transcribe these recordings, to annotate them using annotation software. So at the end of a field trip, this could last maybe several weeks, several months, it all depends. You have a lot of data about this language that before we might not have known too much about. And this data might be notes in notebooks, or it might be recordings on SD cards. And all of this is backed up on several external hard drives. But you want to have it also stored and preserved for a long time, because right now there's very limited people who have access to this. And this is where digital archives come in. So with each recording I make, I mentioned that I check with the community that they're happy for me to make the recording. I show them the recording afterwards, check that they're okay with how the recording came out. And I also ask them, are you happy for the wider public to have access of you speaking, telling your story? And of course you have to check this because there might be sensitive information, there might be taboo topics, and they might not want everyone in the world to have access to this. If they're happy for this to be archived, then this will go in a digital archive. And archiving allows the current diversity and aspects of that to be preserved for the future, to allow future generations to listen to the voices of their ancestors. And it also allows academics or interested parties to hear the sounds of this language, the stories of this language. And of course, throughout the whole process of language documentation, you should be sharing the outcomes with the community. You should be showing them what you're doing, giving it back to them as well. So that was language documentation. Now, what do we mean when we talk about language revitalization? So revitalization may include linguists, it may not include linguists. So revitalization is anything concerned with, anything you do to try and increase the vitality of a language. So this could mean, for example, increasing the range of domains in which the language is used. So if, for example, a language is only used in the family, it would mean taking the family domain and bringing it into new domains, whether that's education, use in the government, etc. It could also mean to increase the number of speakers of a language, so more adults speaking the language, or more children speaking the language. And it could also mean to increase the competence of speakers in their language so that they become more fluent. Language revitalization involves collaboration. So collaboration is key. It involves collaboration between researchers, so whether they're, for example, linguists, educators, applied linguists, and collaboration with community members, of course, to create relevant materials and curricula, as well as context within which the language can be used. Now, language revitalization, it hasn't attracted the same level of funding or recognition as language documentation, and among some linguists, it's also even considered a bit of a waste of time. In terms of what are outcomes of language revitalization, what is produced when you talk about doing language revitalization efforts? So it may involve creating educational materials, which first and foremost involves developing or agreeing upon an orthography. And this in itself involves knowing the sounds of the language. And this is where you see the documentation comes in. The outcomes of documentation can help with revitalization efforts. For some communities, writing an endangered language is perceived as important. And I just want to give you one example of this. So a community member from northern Namibia who, and this is a story told by a colleague of mine, when he first saw his language being written down, the community member said, wow, so I speak a real language. So for him, the idea that writing equated to speaking a real language. And in rural communities such as this one, which is focused very much on oral communication, and the idea of actual writing is very uncommon. It's not something that they, that they do on a regular basis, if at all. But still, this orthography was more on a symbolic level, rather than practical use. And it enabled this community person to have more confidence and respect for his language and his culture. It raised his self-esteem, making him feel that his group had more worth. That being said, it's often assumed that language revitalization means learning in school through educational materials. So whether that's learning as in lessons at school, whether it's immersion programs, bilingual education programs, etc. I think that's a big mistake. If you want a language to be spoken and to continue being spoken, people should be speaking it and not studying at school necessarily. And again, it depends very much on whether producing educational materials makes sense for that community, but I don't think that this is something that should be seen as the only thing to do in language revitalization. And with the advance of technology, it's possible now to be very creative about how to encourage people to use languages. So you can develop apps, for example. But in fact, revitalization takes many forms, and this is something we've been discussing a lot this past week amongst the other residents. So, for example, using verbal arts, theatrical performances, and Sonia's going to be talking about that later in her talk. Also using riddles, tongue twisters, anything to make speaking the language seem fun, seem cool, seem sexy. And we'll be hearing more about these particular topics, as I mentioned earlier, later in the day. Now, one thing to think about with language revitalization is that perspectives and aspirations and goals vary among different language communities. So not all communities want full fluency in a language, and not every community wants that the language is spoken in all domains. So for example, with the mons-speaking community in South Africa, there are only 3 speakers left of this language. For them, revitalization is more on a symbolic level. Mons for them is a marker of their identity. For them to be able to say some words, a few greetings, it's enough for most of the community members. Whereas if you think about the situation for Catalan, for Swahili, for Hawaiian, revitalization efforts involve making it the main language of the community, spoken in all domains with high levels of fluency. So you can see here that aspirations vary among different language communities. Now, I wanted to focus a little bit on language activists. So this is an important group of people in language revitalization efforts. So I mentioned at the beginning that language revitalization is a collaborative effort. It involves many people. So both the community members, within the community, they take different roles, also academics. But language activists can play a very key role in all of this. And I want to use here the definition of language activists provided by Florey, Penfield, and Tucker in their framework on language activism. So they say a language activist is a person who focuses energetic action towards preserving and promoting linguistic diversity and supporting language rights. Now, language activists, Penfield mentions in her work that they may be internal or external. So internal meaning within the community, and these can be various different people. So it could be speakers or learners of a language, it could be community language teachers, it could be community language advocates. And then there are the external language activists. So these are people outside the community, and these could be people living in the country itself. So in my case, it could be in Lesotho, or it could be outside the country. And these include academics, it includes politicians, missionaries, etc. And they can all support language revitalization efforts in a number of different ways. So the activities, again, depend very much on the community, and I just wanted to give some examples of what the two groups could do. But again, as I mentioned, it very much depends on the setting you're working in. So internal language activists, they could, for example, encourage language use in all social contexts. They could develop materials or implement activities. They could serve as a community contact for external activities or raise awareness at the community level. External language activists, on the other hand, they could, for example, train, support, and encourage community members to use the language. They could assist with material development. They could also help to achieve broader media coverage, so beyond kind of community boundaries, and maybe also help with grant writing to larger public sources. Now, what we've seen up to now is that perspectives vary among language activists in different language communities. And I mentioned the example of mons versus Catalan, Swahili, and Hawaiian. But they also vary among linguists who have different interests in language and linguistics. Now, for each project, for each documentation and or revitalization project we undertake, the question to ask is, can linguists and language activists work together to help revitalize an indigenous language? Now, Karen Rice, among many others, argues that it takes a community of people to revitalize an indigenous language. So what I mentioned before with collaborations. And she poses the following questions, which you see on this slide. And these are questions that all of us working with communities, speaking under-described endangered languages should be asking. So what is it that linguists want? What are their goals? What are they trained to do? And what do they do well? And similarly to ask of language activists the same questions. So what is it that language activists want? What are their goals? What are they trained to do? And what do they do well? And putting then the two groups together, so how do the goals of linguists and the goals of language activists mesh with one another? Can they contribute to each other's enterprises? And in the context of language revitalization, I believe that linguists need to work with activists, and vice versa, activists need to work with linguists. And even though they may in their projects have different roles, different outcomes, aspirations, movements, they need to work together for success in each of their work. It's all about collaboration. One thing I wanted to end with this idea with activism is that, and again this comes from Florrie Penfield and Tucker in their framework on language activism, is they say the best chance to preserve linguistic diversity is for each of us to increase the level of activism within our own spheres of influence. I think it's important to be aware that we can't do everything, an individual can't do everything. We have different projects, goals, funding, time restrictions, and we have to be aware of this. So for example, if you're a PhD student who has 3 years to do a project, and you have to produce a grammar of an undescribed language, and you have limited funding, and your funding is for this project only, and yet you have good intentions, you want to do something good for the community, you want to produce maybe materials, you might not be able to do everything, but you can still be an activist within your own sphere of influence, within your own capabilities. So for example, you could share information, announcements on email lists, you could blog about language issues, share skills with the community, archive your data so that others can use it. So even if you can't do everything, do what you can within your own spheres of influence so that others can continue the work. I wanted to end my talk today to think about the important role of language icons in revitalization efforts. So language icons to me are special types of language activists. As I mentioned earlier, languages can only survive if they're spoken by community members. And this usually requires at least one highly motivated community member who's able to encourage the acquisition of the language and its use within the community. But of course, these community members who are highly motivated, they need community support and solidarity. And in light of all of this, I've been thinking this past week at the Faber Residency upon the role of language icons. So these, as I mentioned, highly motivated, dedicated to preserving their languages. They're usually charismatic community members, often considered also to be be the best speakers of their ancestral language. And I was thinking last week about what are the roles they play, what are their aspirations, what motivates them to do what they do. And to answer these questions, I looked at various case studies of language icons from across the world and spoke also to my fellow residents about personal experiences that they had had in such projects. And on this slide, you see a number of language icons that I was looking at, reading their bios, reading about what they do. But in the interest of time, I wanted to focus on one particular language icon. Her name is Katerina Esau, and I had the pleasure of working with her since 2013, and I want to describe a little bit about what drives her to do what she does. So Katerina Esau, she's from South Africa, one of the last speakers of mons, and this is an indigenous click language. There are 3 speakers of the and her family were forbidden to speak their mother tongue. And for half a century, Katerina didn't speak her mother tongue, and she spoke only Afrikaans to her husband and her children. And then in the late 90s, through the initiative of Llengües, about 20 members of the community revealed their competence in the language. So they hadn't spoken this language for a long time, and finally they made themselves known that they do speak this language. And they started to, as a group, remember and recover the mother tongue of their youth. And they worked together with linguists discussing terms, sentences, also listening to old mons recordings from archives. And in this way, Katerina regained her fluency in the language. And since 2003, she's been engaged in teaching her language to children and other community members. So passing on the mons language to the younger generation, it's her life passion. She's very vocal about this, she's charismatic, the community likes her and respects her. And even though she's now currently in her mid-80s, she's not literate, she does everything she can to fight for her cause. She believes very strongly that other people have their own languages, and I'm quoting now from her. Why must my language be allowed to die? It must go on. As long as there are people, the language must go on. So she founded a school and she teaches her language to children in the neighborhood, often with very limited resources, but with a lot of enthusiasm and energy and support from the community. For Omar Ahmed, as I mentioned, she's not literate, but having teaching and learning materials seemed for her to be quite important. And for that reason, she approached my colleague Matthias Brenzinger, who some of you may know because he was here last year, and requested support in developing educational materials for her teaching. What she said is that children went to school in the mornings and they had learning material for all their other subjects. So when they studied Afrikaans, or when they studied history, or when they studied maths, they had textbooks, they had learning materials. And then in the afternoon, they came to her school and they had no teaching materials. And she wanted that her language had the same value as these other subjects that these children were learning. And for her, this meant having educational materials. So since 2013, Matthias and I have been working with Ahmed, her students, their families, and with the wider community to produce teaching and learning materials. We were very lucky that some documentation of the language already exists, and we worked to continue this documentation and worked with Ahmed to see kind of what was meaningful for her, what would make sense to produce. So we sat in on her classes, saw what she was teaching, what topics is she teaching, how is she teaching the children, what do the children enjoy learning. And in this way, through our observations, and together with the community, we produced relevant, meaningful teaching materials. And one outcome is this book that you see on this slide, which is freely available online. And it's a 160-page trilingual reader, which contains words, sentences, games, songs, and prayers in mons. And this is a photo you can see of Omar Ahmed with some of the children in her school. And you can see on the right-hand side a lady, her name is Claudia Dessi. And I mentioned earlier that Omar Ahmed is not literate, but she is a speaker of mons. And because she wants that the children also, use the textbooks, learn how to read and write, she co-teaches with her granddaughter, Claudia Duplessis, who's on the right. And Claudia is not a speaker of mons, but she's learning it, but she is literate. So the two really work as a team to translate this language to the younger generation. And I wanted to end with a little video which shows two former students of Omar Pyramid School. This is Marianne and Gavin, and they're greeting each other in mons. And here you can see that they learned, so they were attending Omar Pyramid School. They learned the language through teaching materials through Omar Pyramid, and now they speak not fluently, but they have basic knowledge of mons. Which shows that her efforts are paying off. Omar Pyramid's efforts are paying off. And I just wanted to end by thanking everyone, thanking Llengüepax, the Faber Residency. This has been a very inspiring time for me and allowed me to reflect really a lot on what the work I do in conversation with the other residents. So thank you very much.
Han plantejat temes superinteressants. Estem una mica malament de temps. No sé si l'organització permet intervencions del públic encara. Sí. També voldria agrair molt a la cabina de traducció la seva competència, perquè no és fàcil traduir a la doctora Sheena amb la seva velocitat i, francament, enhorabona. Hi ha preguntes al públic?
Thank you both. This is actually a question for Sheena. I'm struck by this kind of categorization of the linguists and the activists on kind of different camps. Particularly considering the role, you mentioned missionaries and the way salvage, let's say salvage ethnography and the idea in the 19th century, early 20th century, this idea of recording languages as well was different cultural practice was so prevalent, and how that's actually been taken up subsequently by many indigenous communities and kind of given a different purpose. And I guess I'm just interested to hear your perspective on how much that experience and the lessons learned from that has actually shaped current practice, because so much of the language we use in terms of preservation and endangered and recording language is still kind of resonant with the old terms, let's say. So how much kind of has there been a reshaping of these practices in light of the earlier experience, and then also how much collapsing is there between the two kind of camps of activists and linguists, considering that many of the activists could also actually be linguists.
Absolutely, and I fully agree. So just taking first the last point you mentioned, so I was thinking a lot when I was preparing this, that it is dangerous to separate the two, right? Because you also do have linguists who are activists, and it's interesting when you read sometimes people's bio, and they'll say, I'm a linguist and an activist, or it's often the two terms are put as if they're separate, but actually you can be both. What I've noticed is in the African context is there is a bit more of a divide, so people would say I'm a linguist or I'm an activist, and there's less of the two together. So I know very few who would say that they're both a linguist and an activist. But I know that in other parts of the world, that's different. And through this past week, when I was in conversation with people working in very different parts of the world, became very aware that this notion is quite different in different places. Going back to your earlier question, so the question, can you just, repeat that again? It was about the missionaries?
I guess it's just kind of a bit of a reflection, but to what extent, thinking of digital archives, so in a community scenario where obviously there's free prior informed consent in the way we're doing things, but in a scenario where there's actually quite difficult access subsequently to digital archives because of various issues around electricity and bandwidth, etc. And that's not to say there aren't moments when obviously there is interaction with those archives, but I'm always concerned that we're kind of creating new colonial archives that remain kind of out of reach for the user communities. Yeah. And then, well, maybe down the line something similar will happen, and there's going to be kind of a rematriation of that work. But I'm just wondering about the kind of pressing debates in light of what's happened and these very inventive and creative ways of using old missionary texts and dictionaries, and and how that's been taken up subsequently, which has obviously given a new angle on those old colonial archives.
Absolutely.
In light of the digital terms.
And I think archives is one topic that several of us this past week have been talking a lot about, because I think they promise a lot of great things, but there's also the danger that we collect all this data, then they're stored in archives, but actually the community has no access to these recordings, or that they've made these archives in a way that don't really allow community members, even if they have electricity and internet access, the language is all in English. How do they then access these recordings so they don't even understand what's on the website? And for me, particularly now with the current project I'm working on in Lesotho, I'm battling a little bit with myself about how do I, because I have to, as a linguist, fulfill these duties in terms of, as a language, as someone documenting languages, it's expected that we're putting our stuff in archives, but at the same time, how do I make sure that I can return these materials to the community in a way that makes sense to them? As I mentioned, they don't have electricity, they have basically also very little internet access, if at all. It doesn't make sense for me to hand them, DVDs or CDs because they can't use that, they don't have computers. So how do I then give back all these stories, all these narratives? And right now, I don't have an answer for that, and one thing I'm doing is very much talking to the community members, telling them these are things I'm thinking. Let's dialogue about this. How can we make this accessible to you? What can we produce so that you have, because first and foremost, the material should be returned to the community. So I'm a very strong advocate of that, and I think that this is something that has to be determined from the very beginning. It can't be an afterthought afterwards, because that's dangerous. And I've seen cases where communities are given a USB stick and they don't know what to do with this USB stick, and I think that's very wrong. We have to think about this from the very beginning.
Good morning. This is a question for Dr. Llanes. I'm interested about which kind of relation exists between the Mayan movement, the language movement, and politics. Because these several questions. For instance, there is a separatist movement from Yucatan, because I know that Yucatan was an independent republic many years ago. I think in the 19th century. Because I was very surprised to show video the young people with the Mexican flag. An open question, the relation between the Mayan struggle for the kind of deputy language and politics and so on.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Can I just say before that, talking about colonialism in relation relation to language documentation. I was quite struck by the picture of by this technique to record the pronunciation. As a person whose ancestors were measured and weighed, and I found that horrifying. I mean, I know it's not. It's part of the maybe the methodology, but I don't know if somebody has pointed out that this is reminiscent of, all practices of anthropology and biological anthropology and so on. But for me, I struggle with the image, because it's so graphic, and I wonder if somebody studying the pronunciation of the royal or the British royal family will subject the royal British family to this kind of technique to register the pronunciation. Where does the words sound in their mouths, in the mouth of Queen Elizabeth II? But anyway, so that's. I just want to say. I know it's.
Can I just add?
Sure.
Since we're talking about this, so I agree that this is quite a horrifying thing to do. And one thing I think is always important when you're introducing something like this is you have to be aware of things like this. Like, what are the connotations when you're explaining that you want to do this? And you have to very much respect that if people find this weird or strange, don't do it. And what I did with this particular, when we were doing this, is we did it first myself, and we showed them the process, and we showed them kind of why we were doing this, and we even tried to explain to them linguistically. We said, oh look, now you see this picture, and this picture is different from this picture, and it shows us as linguists that you're producing this sound like this, where the tongue is touching this part of the roof of the mouth. And actually, what we found quite surprising actually is that young people were really fascinated to see, oh, when I'm producing this click, it's, this part of my mouth is like this. But of course, I fully understand that you can't, it's a strange thing, and it's to expect that people will be willing to engage in this. And we did have a few people where they didn't want to do this for various reasons. And this is, of course, completely fine. But I think with many of these practices, if, I think it's important to show that, so I guess with the community we were working with, they were scared about if it's harmful, is it gonna come off? They had kind of different ideas about it. But when they saw, okay, Sheena's done it, this other person's done it, and then they were kind of wanting to try it. But of course not everyone.
And about your question, yeah, that's an interesting one. Actually, the Yucatan has been independent from Mexico 3 times. But interestingly, the 3 times that Yucatan became independent from Mexico was the white, or what we would call the white people of Spanish descent, the ones who were at the front of this independence movement. And the reasons why they wanted to become independent from the Yucatan is because they wanted to keep the privileges. For the whole of the 19th century, there was a system of semi-enslavement of indigenous people in the Yucatan, and at various times during the 19th century, when liberal reforms or progressive reforms in the central part of Mexico were enacted, the elites in Yucatan resisted by breaking up with the country. So understandably, we indigenous peoples in the Yucatan, we feel quite protected by, in a sense, by the rights, by the citizenship rights that we enjoy as citizens of the Republic. But of course, there's also problems with this idea of a liberal citizenship, and it's part of the struggle. But I think even the Zapatista, who rose in arms against the Mexican state in 1994, as you probably all know, they will also be very proud of being Mexican. And there was a very famous moment when, at the beginning of the peace talks between the Zapatista army and the Mexican government, they pull out the Mexican flag, and they show the Mexican flag and say, we don't want a country without us being taken seriously within the country. So I guess that the nationalist project in Mexico operated on the different premises and maybe was more successful than the Spanish state nationalist project for reasons that we can talk about more later. Thank you for the question.
L'última pregunta, no tenim més temps, li he demanat la paraula.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Llanes. This makes the case about the influence of rock music amongst the Maya youth. Has made me think about paradox that is faced by many minority languages, particularly in Europe, where they may face the dual challenge of social erosion and also many times the lack of official recognition, at least in most countries. I'm not speaking about Spain, of course. And the paradox is that whilst these a lot of minority languages tend to be retreating in the public space, they tend to become more and more alive in the cultural arena, especially through all kinds of different genres of music. And so, as they tend to become more visible and more popular through rap, rock, ragamuffin, you name it, the stigma seems to be gone. But at the same time, we still have a problem of the transmission of those languages. And so my question is the following. I would like to know to what extent the growing success of pop and rap music, say, in Maya land, has had an impact on the perception amongst the youths of the Maya language as having a future, as having an economic and social potential for them, whilst they may enjoy it, let's say, in their free time, at the cultural level. They perceive now that language as really having a future in a context which is dominated by Spanish. And second of all, have you noticed a change even in terms of communications amongst the youth? Have you noticed some sort of a shift, even sporadically, in terms of using Spanish and Maya amongst the youth, now that they tend to become more proud about their heritage language? Thank you.
Thank you. Both of them very interesting questions, actually. So about the effect of Maya hip-hop and other genres, actually, because it's not just hip-hop. Hip-hop is the most popular or in fashion at the moment. But there's reggae, there's ragamuffin, as you said, there's dancehall, there's many other genres. But hip-hop seems to be right now something of a focus of attention for both the state institutions but also the general public, which find this completely, I would say, like postmodern. So they have the attraction of feeling very postmodern, very hip. So at the level of the young people in the Yucatan, I think that the reception is mixed, because there are some, and perhaps the reception is more strong or more energetic with young Maya people who have migrated to the cities. So it's in I showed in the map Cancun and Mérida as two of the main sites where young people, adults, everybody is migrating for work and to get close to where the economic activities are. So these young people might be, and actually are more open, and they have, the community of Maya hip hop performers has increased from the time of Fat Boy, who was the first who started 10 years ago. So now there's a network, there's a broader network of young people who find in this cultural expression some sort of mobility, because they mobility in both the social and the geographical sense, because they can get some sort of rewards. If they go to a cultural festival, they get food, they get small payments. So they're constantly, sort of being rewarded, positively reinforcing this appreciation of Maya language. On the other hand, they also move constantly geographically. So Pat Boy has been in Los Angeles, constantly in Mexico City. He works with Jose Antonio, which we're going to present later on, in many different projects. So there's also this geographical sense of mobility. But the vast majority, I would say, of young people in Maya rural communities, they don't have access, or maybe this music doesn't give them much. But this is a problem to do with the circulation, with the distribution of the music, because radio companies won't broadcast this music commercially, like they do with the English music, or they do with the Spanish music, or they do even with French music, or with other languages, some random language from the globe. They don't do that typically with Maya songs. So that it is a problem. But I think that it's also to do with the genre, because for most rural young people, they prefer genres like cumbia, what we call tropical, or even reggaeton. But reggaeton hasn't. There has been some attempts to do reggaeton in Maya, but that wasn't really rewarded by the state institutions, because they don't have any. They don't want to have anything to do with reggaeton. Reggaeton is being demonized in Mexico generally, socially. And because of the class perception of the music. So yeah, it's a mixed response. And the second one was about, sorry, I forgot. Yeah. Typically, the new Maya song is monolingual, which means that it doesn't code switch. And so in that sense, it has offered some new ways of reconnecting with maybe old words, ancient words that were no longer spoken daily. But the young people who sing hip-hop, they're constantly code switching between Spanish and Maya and even English. There's a famous title of a play, a comedy, original comedy play, which was Bash on the Brother, which combined Bash, which is the interrogation word, Onda, which is a Spanish word, and Brother, which is an English word typically. So there's a code switching between among three languages, which is happens more and more these days, and especially with the young community who live in Los Angeles and San Francisco and all of these places.
Bé, moltes gràcies. Ens anem molt tard. Potser podem escurçar una mica la pausa, en 20 minuts, o el que digui Llengües, i ens trobem d'aquí 20 minuts. Una altra vegada aquí. Moltes gràcies als ponents i al públic.